is Stacy on the Right. Here's your host, Stacy Washington.
Welcome back to Stacy on the Right here on SiriusXM Patriot Channel 125. We are live and direct with our next guest. If you want to join us to talk about everything that was going on in the show before right now, well, it's 866-957-2874. We'll be going to calls after our next guest, Joshua Crawford, Director of Criminal Justice Initiatives at the Georgia Center for Opportunity. Thank you so much for coming on tonight, Joshua.
Thank you for having me.
So let's first talk about the Georgia Center for Opportunity. What do you do there?
So I'm the Director of Criminal Justice Initiatives, and so my work focuses on improving public safety in the most vulnerable communities around the country. So that includes parts of Atlanta, Georgia, parts of Louisville, Kentucky, where I live, and cities all across the country.
All right. So criminal justice reform. Well, it's a lot of very angry people. When they hear that, they're like, oh, no, we don't want to hear anything about that. Talk to us about the specific type of criminal justice reform that you support through your organization.
Yeah, so what I primarily do is focus on reducing violence in American cities. In any given city in the country, it's typically about 0.5% of your population that is responsible for more than 50% of your violence. It typically occurs within the subcontext of criminal street gangs, and so a very small number of people makes life very difficult for entire communities. And so by focusing resources, those are law enforcement resources, those are corrections resources, but there are also things like social service resources on those populations, you can dramatically reduce violence while not sort of flooding communities with cops in a way that can lead to some negative interactions.
So that is actually an astounding focus to have right now in October of 2022, where crime is up across all metrics and ambushes of police officers are up as well. I was reading 11 police officers shot just within the last couple of days across the country, and a number of ambushes where they showed up responding to a 911 call and were gunned down. Lots of deaths. So it's a profession that is experiencing a profound amount of loss of actual employees. Like you have officers leaving, retiring, changing careers, and then you have officers being ambushed. So morale is down across law enforcement across the country. How do you kind of marry that with the work that you do?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. One of the single most important things that law enforcement does is what's referred to as self-initiated police activity. So that's everything that a cop does that's not a response to a call for service. So it's things like motor vehicle and street stops, but it's also broadly what we think of as community policing. It's checks on businesses, checks on abandoned buildings, interacting with the community in a positive way. Self-initiated police activity over the last couple of years has fallen off a cliff. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is a lot of what you're talking about, that cops don't feel like people have their backs the way they used to, and so they're less inclined to put themselves in a risky situation, not necessarily because they're any more worried about their life than they were before, but they're more worried about their livelihood than they ever were before. Are they going to end up on social media for doing the right thing, but that seems bad when you do it in a slow-motion video? The other thing is that you mentioned this as well. Cops are retiring. Recruitment and retention is down across the country, especially in large city police departments. And so even if officers were doing the same amount of self-initiated activity that they were doing before, you got fewer officers doing it. And so that is really negatively impacting these things. And you see a positive relationship between declines in self-initiated police activity and homicides in a big way.
Wow. So let's delve into your work. The reason you wanted to join tonight. You talk about reining in violent crime and how that helps people who need economic opportunity. Most people assume that high crime areas are, it's like the whole place is just riddled with crime and most of the people who live there are criminals. That's not even close to being the case. It's a bad reputation for those communities. Your article is over at the Chicago Sun-Times. Talk to us about how the loss of businesses and the basically economic flight actually helps exacerbate rising crime rates.
Yeah, so people think that the directional relationship between crime and poverty is that increased poverty leads to increased crime. And there's some truth in that in the academic literature as it relates to property crime, right? If you don't have food, you may steal some food, something like that. That relationship really doesn't exist directionally that way as it relates to violent crime, and to the extent that there's a relationship at all, it tends to be the inverse. That is, as communities experience increases in crime, economic opportunities leave. That if you take a neighborhood that is relatively poor, relatively historically marginalized, relatively socially isolated, and you increase the crime in that neighborhood, the crime increases for a variety of reasons. The economic mobility among the bottom quartile that live in that community drops off considerably. And so businesses leave, businesses don't expand, and there's really not a whole lot that policymakers can do with economic levers to try to encourage businesses to come into these neighborhoods. A lot of these things are temporary at best if you don't get that violent crime under control. And so it just makes life more difficult for the law-abiding citizens in those communities.
Yeah, and then there's also the issue of the fact that talking to the police, assisting with investigations can get community members killed. They actually have had cases of that. One of the most prominent ones was in Ferguson. One of the people who was communicating with law enforcement at the federal level after the Mike Brown shooting was actually his body was found in a car that was set on fire. I don't remember exactly how he was killed, but those are lessons for people who live there not to cooperate with the police.
Yeah, witness intimidation in the direct sense is a serious problem. And then just this general idea that gang members are more omnipresent in the neighborhood than cops could ever be creates this culture of fear. And when you look around and what you see around you is disorder, right, is abandoned buildings, overgrown vacant lots, gang members sort of conducting business with impunity, then the reality that you experience is that is the dominant culture in the neighborhood. Never mind that the overwhelming majority of the people in that neighborhood are law-abiding citizens who are just trying to provide a better life for themselves and their children. But what you experience is that's who controls the neighborhood. The cops don't control the neighborhood. And so there have been some innovative strategies that have been attempted around the country to try to reduce witness intimidation. Some of them have been successful. And so to the extent that we can apply best practices to that, we can help encourage cooperation among community members and law enforcement.
Yeah, and anything that encourages members of the community, people who actually live there, in cooperating with the police brings about a better environment for the police to investigate and do their work in. What other suggestions do you have for people who maybe they have a relative who lives in a higher crime area and they're trying to figure out what they can do?
Yeah, so this is sort of the responsibility of everyone. The primary actors in reducing violence are going to be entities of government, right? It's going to be law enforcement. It's going to be corrections officials, but nonprofits, churches especially, community groups, and individual community members have a role to play, especially in trying to keep predominantly young men from finding their way down a negative life course. It is much easier to keep an 11-year-old from ever picking up a gun than it is to convince a 17-year-old who's been involved in a number of drive-by shootings to put that gun down and never pick it back up. And so, especially as it relates to prevention efforts, the community, churches, nonprofits have critical roles to play.
Yeah, so nonprofits, and I know that there's a lot of great work that's being done by individuals who, former NFL players who are running organizations that go into communities, and there's mentoring, and there's all kinds of wonderful things that are happening. But on the scale of, in comparison with the level of crime, we have to kind of look at the impact that these prosecutors have had with these new these are it's the flavor of the month, no cash bail, or, ROR, or even for violent crimes, a list of crimes we just won't prosecute anymore. Those things are actually making crime worse.
That's absolutely true. And a lot of those progressive prosecutors sold themselves by saying that they were going to focus away from small and petty crimes so that they could focus on the big stuff. We're not going to prosecute very small or menial offenses. We're going to focus on the big stuff, and so we're going to have a lot more benefit that way. And in truth, a lot of these prosecutors almost immediately started to do things that benefited serious and violent offenders. The San Francisco district attorney, who was recently recalled, refused to apply gang enhancements in any cases across the board. The current Philadelphia district attorney has neglected to prosecute serious felon in possession of firearm cases. There have been a number of very serious offenses that have been not prosecuted all across the country or have been treated much less severely than they should. And this matters, right? The violent and serious offenders that we're talking about, the people who are most involved in criminal activity, understand the system oftentimes as well, if not better, than the practitioners in the system. And so they know if things aren't getting prosecuted, they can get away with those things, and this stuff tends to escalate. There was an analysis done recently in Philadelphia that found that changes in prosecuting in Philadelphia is directly related to the increase in homicides that city has experienced.
Whew. And so, and none of the conversation that you and I are having, as wonderful as it is, can properly put a kind of a picture, paint a picture for people of those who, the victims of crime, their families. It is just, we can't really articulate it. This is something that's going on across the country. Lives are being changed because people are being subjected to criminals who should be held on bail, who should be refused to be allowed out because they have committed or are accused of committing violent crimes, and they're going out and violently reoffended. And some of them is domestic violence cases. I'm reading stories about men who have literally been put in jail for beating up on their wife or girlfriend who come out and kill them. So it's the stuff Hollywood used to make movies out of. Now it's our reality.
There are a couple of quick stories I'll share with you. The first is of a young boy named Daquante Hobbs Jr., who was 7 years old, sitting at his kitchen table in 2017, eating birthday cake and playing educational games on a tablet. Across the street, there was an illegal dice game happening behind an abandoned building. That dice game turned into a dispute. Somebody pulled out a gun, fired multiple rounds. One of those rounds traveled across the street, struck Daquante in the back of the head. He bled out on the floor while his mom army crawled into the kitchen, or into the dining room, to try to save his life with mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Here in Louisville, a 3-year-old girl by the name of Trinity Randolph was executed while playing in a Disney playhouse. Malachi Roberts was a 5-year-old boy who was shot and blinded. Thankfully, he survived in Lexington, Kentucky. And Malachi will be blind for the rest of his life. And when the individuals who shot up his house were arrested, they admitted that they had the wrong house. They had shot up the wrong house. The target did not, in fact, live there. This is the senseless violence, the loss of life, the loss of quality of life that is the reality for the people who are impacted by this. Mothers who will never see their children again, young boys who will never see again themselves.
And so the carnage is not depicted on the news. I see a lot of stories about, former President Trump, things like that. I think President Trump's pretty great, but he has zero impact on crime or any of the other things that Americans are facing right now, yet the focus on him seems to be pathological to the detriment of all of these other very serious issues, especially the one you're working with at your organization, the Georgia Center for Opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that the way that folks like us at GCO and some folks at other think tanks push back is to highlight some of these stories, to have conversations like this to make people aware. 8 in 10 Americans are concerned about violent crime right now. Black Americans list violent crime as their number 2 priority going into the midterms. This is something that is impacting Americans all across the country, and Americans are concerned about. And so it's important that policymakers, legislators, governors, mayors understand not only the seriousness with which the American people are taking this issue, but how to properly address this issue if and when they're in elected office, so that we don't have the serious problem that we have right now.
So the answer to the Soros Prosecutors, what are you recommending to people? Because November is upon us. We will have the opportunity to weigh in. And a lot of people have expressed a little bit of confusion, because it's not like Soros prosecutors say, hey, I'm supported by George Soros. You have to almost be an information maven or a researcher to find that information out. They often sound like really kind of normal prosecutors until they get in office and make these announcements. Some of them run on it, but most of them, they kind of keep that to themselves. What do you recommend for people who are going to vote and they have a prosecutor up on the ballot in November?
Trust your eyes and your ears. You know what your surroundings look like. And so I think that that's what happened in San Francisco. San Francisco is as blue an area, as progressive an area as it gets. And the residents of San Francisco were fed up with failed policies from a prosecutor who didn't treat serious crime seriously, and he's no longer in office. If it can happen in San Francisco, it can happen just about anywhere. But trust your eyes. I mean, you know what's going on around you better than folks who may try to convince you otherwise.
I love it. So I think, these are just the very beginnings of conversations that I hope you'll join us to have on how we can have safer streets and neighborhoods and encourage cooperation between members of a community and the police officers who serve them. We do need reforms, but we also need more good information, which is part of what you're providing. Tell everyone how to find the Georgia Center for Opportunity.
So it's foropportunity.org. That's the website. And if you want to follow me on social media, it's jcrawford502 on Instagram. I don't use Twitter. I don't have the stomach for it. But feel free to interact with me on Instagram.
Well, so you're free, more free than I am. Good for you. Exactly. Don't give in. If you're not on there already, the fun's already, you don't need to get on there. I tell people this all the time. They're like, oh, maybe I should join Twitter. I'm like, why? You're free. You're actually free.
Right.
Well, it's great.
I'll see what Kanye West does with Parler.
You know what? It's an interesting time. Interesting time to be on social media. Now, I'm already on Parler. I'm just waiting on somebody to show me something. So if that's where I need to be, I'm happy to be there as well. Joshua Crawford, Director of Criminal Justice Initiatives at the Georgia Center for Opportunity. Thank you for coming on tonight.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Have a wonderful evening.